This is the Nobel Podcast, where we talk about how to optimize your technology, life, and mind. We're joined by special operations veterans, entrepreneurs, investors, and others who have overcome difficulty to make it to the top of their craft by staying in the fight. Sam Alaimo, welcome to the Nobel Podcast. I have with me John Robb, Air Force counterterrorism expert, military strategist, entrepreneur, author of The Brave New War, and writes the Global Guerrilla Report on Substack and Patreon. John, welcome aboard.
Hey, Sam.
Let's start from the very beginning. Where did you grow up?
Grew up in Watertown, Connecticut, and then went to Germany for high school. My dad was with IBM. He's also in the Guard, but went to Germany, and I lived south of Munich for 3 years. Went to the Munich International School. It was great. One thing I learned when doing that, and I think it's good for everybody to do that when they're younger, is that you don't know the barriers and kind of limitations that you have on your thinking, on what your potential is and what you could potentially do until you move outside of that, comfort zone. Leaving a high school with a certain high school mentality and then going to a new place and then having all those barriers lift and say, oh, well, I can do anything. I can live anywhere. I can accomplish almost anything. That's a good thing to give your kids if you could get a chance to do it.
Do you think that the international upbringing influenced where you're currently at now, your strategic mindset?
Traveled all over Europe. Was in Vienna during the SALT talks. Got to see Carter and Brezhnev. And that was in the 70s. And also it was like the later years of Carter's administration. And, everybody was against it. The U.S. at the time, every European was like talking down the U.S. and kind of made me kind of a defender of the U.S. in terms of just arguing against it, even more so than I would have been normally. Yeah, it gave me a different perspective. I understand how Europeans think. I understand, how a lot of different countries think because it was an international school, which is a good thing to have going into the rest of your life.
What was the earliest memory you have of wanting to join the military?
Well, I mean, I have a military family, so everybody's involved. My two younger brothers followed me into the Air Force Academy. One is just retired from the NSA. He ran all their hardware. And the other one is retired as a physical therapist, works with special ops, now working with the Marines on concussion recovery. And then my father was in the Air National Guard, and it was kind of part of our life. He was flew fighters for the Vermont Air National Guard, and then flew C-130s for the New Hampshire Air National Guard. Was the chief of staff for that unit. My father-in-law was a navigator on Buffs during Vietnam. My uncle flew fighters in Alpha carriers in Vietnam. And then his son became a Marine aviator, flew F-18s. And my brother-in-law married my sister. He's an F-16 jockey, lives in Michigan. So it's all military. So it was kind of the thing to do. And I always, had a desire to launch myself in the military. One of the things I saw from people going through the civilian side was they didn't know what they were going to do. When you see a senior graduating college and they have this look of fear in their eyes, you go, okay, well, I don't want to go through that. I would like to have kind of my path set. So that was one of the reasons why I joined the military. And the other was I wanted to become an astronaut. Funny thing at the time. And the only place that offered astronautical engineering that I could find was the Air Force Academy. And so I, in part, joined to take the astronautical engineering degree and then go into flying and then potentially get into test pilot school and then combine that into an astronaut slot. But unfortunately, halfway through pilot training for me, the shuttle blew up and the program died. And then I started talking to the astronauts in the program and they were like, this is the horrible thing. You never want to join because if you're not going up, they start doing tests on you, like injecting air bubbles into your bloodstream to see how your heart would respond. And they go, you don't have to do this, but if you don't do it, you're yanked from the program. And so these guys are like, okay, so bitter. I'm so angry. And I thought, okay, not for me. So didn't go that track. Yeah, the military's been great. It's great to have that kind of trajectory, know where you're going to go, and then you get a bunch of skills and you get a bunch of experience operating independently, operating within organizations. It's good stuff.
Last time we talked, you brought up your uncle and experience in Vietnam. Can you give us a story?
Yeah, he didn't talk about it much until later in life, but he was shot down in Vietnam, over North Vietnam, coming back from a mission. He's about 20, 30 miles off from the coast, back to his carrier. And apparently his plane was damaged. It wasn't going to, it took some damage from a missile, I suspect, proximity. And he ejected, came down, and successfully landed, packed up his chute, called in his location, said he was alive. He was going to head up to the top of a hill. He gave him the coordinates, and they started sending in to helicopter to go rescue him. Started to make his way up the hill, and he got about 2/3 of the way up, and he heard chatting and some people up at the top of the hill, and he goes, "Okay, that's going to be NVA regulars, and I'm not going to go up there." So he sat tight and waited until he heard the helicopter, and he heard the helicopter coming in, and he broke some smoke and said, "Don't go up to the top of the hill. I'm part way down." And they came over, dropped the penetrator. He hopped in, and by then the regulars at the top of the hill started running down, shooting at the helicopter. And then as he started to raise above get above the canopy, they started shooting at him. And one of the bullets apparently hit the cable that was pulling him up, and it didn't fully snap it. It just frayed it enough that it got caught in the winch. So they secured it in place. And here he is, 20, 30, 40 feet below the helicopter with bullets whizzing by. And then the pilot's like, "Okay, we're going." And they hauled him out while he's, flailing in the wind out over water. And then they dropped him in, and the SEALs dropped in and picked him up and got him back. So it's a pretty hairy story. He became pretty liberal after that. We got back.
I wanted to ask that. It's about as close as you can get. What was his memory of Vietnam? When you say you got pretty liberal, what does that mean?
I think he was negative on the whole experience. And I think it kind of, that whole personal experience kind of clarified it for him. He became, very anti-Vietnam, very anti-U.S. adventurism in the world, and decided to work for the Forestry Service in Vermont instead and spend his time out in nature. It was a life-changing event for him.
So from that, you went to the U.S. Air Force Academy to become a pilot. You want to talk about what you did in the military?
Got out of pilot training, spent a couple of years of flying C-130s and mostly Europe, Central South America, and Middle East. But it was very vanilla stuff where you get, the standard control where you call in before you take off, and you call in once you get up to altitude, and that whole thing. And then I got recruited into a special access program to do a different kind of flying, more in, getting teams in and out of countries, a lot of night vision work, non-inventory aircraft, that kind of stuff. Yeah, that was a completely different experience. So I spent 5 years doing that, living on a beeper, 2-hour recall, 220 days a year on the road, lots of work in Central South America, some in Africa, some in the Southwest Asia. Yeah, it was a different experience, flying a lot of night vision goggle work, really low level, 50 feet, back with those old night vision goggles where you're 2200 vision. But, being able to do that kind of navigation to get you, after 6 hours of flying over canopy, to land on a road, infrared runway on a road within, 30 seconds of the desired time, and do it consistently. Yeah, that was a big challenge. So, it was a different kind of program. It was more staying unnoticed, getting into a place that politically you're not allowed to be, getting a team out, getting a team in, getting people of interest out, or, people who were like evacuating, say an embassy. There were some staff out that were at risk. Yeah, it was a challenging mission.
What time are we talking about? 90s?
Late 80s, early 90s. So all the programs in that space came out of the disaster in the desert in Iran, and during the failed hostage rescue attempt there. And so they started a whole bunch of programs, lots of them wild, and got wilder as the defense budget built up in the 80s. But ultimately, it was a different environment. The U.S. wasn't nearly as adventurous as it was during the post 9/11 environment. because we had an adversaries on the other side. If we pushed too hard, it could have, strategic complications because there was the Soviet Union was still in place. But it was focused on counterterrorism, which was probably the earliest, focus on that issue in particular. At the time, there was a lot of narco-terrorism in Central South America. And then that was our clear focus. And then the first Gulf War happened. There were a lot of pressures on us politically not to do too much. Ambassadors all had, their hair on fire when we arrived. But yeah, it was a fun thing.
These special mission units are unique in that some people go out of their way to try to get into them, and then some people just out of the blue are asked to join them.
Right.
Which bucket do you fall into there? Did you seek it out, or did they find you?
Well, this is the kind of unit that it was so buried that nobody knew about. So they had to recruit. Very few people actually came in, and the few people that I actually saw that came in because they knew about the unit because they were attached, at some paperwork level, weren't usually that good. But the people that were recruited directly, like me, seemed to do pretty good. It was pretty demanding. It required a totally different mindset than the standard military. It's kind of, you go off and do a mission for a couple of weeks, and here's a plane, and here's a wad of cash, here's some people to work with, here's some contacts along the way. Standard military doesn't work that way. And, if you have some shitters in the back and you're bringing them to point Y, you're responsible for talking them through that whole place, because most of those guys can't do that. You don't want to put them in a situation where they have to ask, answer complex questions and get snagged. No, so that was the kind of recruiting, getting pulled in.
Do you know why they picked you? Why did they say, I want John Robb, and then find you and pull you in?
I mean, I'm not the best of employees. I was a very entrepreneurial kind of streak, and I kind of tend to try to make decisions on my own and, question a lot of stuff. So I think that it was part, this guy is hard to handle, and part, which is exactly what they happened to be looking for, is somebody that could think on their feet on their own. So it was kind of a good mesh.
Okay. So, I mean, that's interesting. Can you give like one example or two examples, concrete examples of a mission you did, maybe a difficult landing, something pretty wazoo?
One of the last missions I did, and I flew up to the end, which is kind of unusual in the military because they tend to, as soon as you put your papers in, they yank you about 6 months out. And I was doing an exfil, and I picked up, I think, 4 shooters, and I had a tank in behind me full of about 500 pounds of jet fuel. It was in a turboprop, took off out of the road that I was on, flew low level, came to land on another road, which is the place I'm going to drop these guys off and proceed. And, I was on the heavy side when I was landing, but just under it by a hair, and landed in the box, the IR box, perfectly. It was like a feather landing. And then the left wheel popped, and put in the differential braking and the differential thrust. And I slowly but surely moved over to the left side of the road, and it just went into the grass. And usually these roads don't have a lot of space. There's sometimes trees, obviously, and telephone poles. In this case, we stopped, and there wasn't any big boom or anything. And we got out and looked, and there was the nose wheel was just about 1.5 feet, 2 feet away from a culvert, one of those big, concrete culverts with the big tubes that go underneath a road. Well, the front end, the feed end, was right in front of us. So we would have dropped about 20 feet down. And with turboprops, that would have gone, with all that fuel, it would have just been boom. It would have been a mess. One of the things that helps is if we're pretty lucky. Yeah, I tended to be pretty lucky on a lot of this stuff.
This makes me wonder, you had to have been pretty jazzed up on some of these missions, the horrible night vision goggles, the difficult landings off-road. I'd imagine you were extremely locked on and engaged and on point. I wonder if you think about that sometimes post-military. Have you been able to attain that sort of peak optimal cognitive engagement? Do you think about that? Have you been able to replicate it?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think a good portion of my life was post-military is trying to find ways to replicate that so I can get work done at a peak flow. But in the post-military environment, it wasn't just actually getting things done for me. It was also being creative, trying to come up with new stuff, new strategies. Like the indirect approach to solving a problem that was complex. And often I could come up with creative solutions to things that would be too expensive or too difficult to challenge head on. But getting to that point is really tough. I've always thought that being creative is all great. And, a lot of people are creative and stuff, but being a pragmatic creative, meaning that the experience actually flying and trying out new things, but being constrained by the environment and knowing that if you screw up, it's going to blow up, was a good thing I took on. And, as I started to create things, as an entrepreneur in business and everything else, trying to come up with really innovative solutions, but they're always pragmatic at core. They always, try to conform to reality to the extent possible. You can see a line on how to actually pull it off. And that's not something you often see in people who are coming from academia or other places, because they don't have that threat, never experienced any real world danger, or weren't out in the operational environment where that kind of mindset was forced on them. So they don't have that constant eye out for seeing the practicality of actually what they're doing.
I've seen it a lot. Some of the best or maybe most effective thinkers are those who experience what you're talking about, where they know that one bad idea could literally lead to broken bones or loss of life. And that is something you don't easily forget. And when you move into the realm of thinking and of philosophizing and of strategy, it tends to ground those high level concepts and make them more applicable in the real world. So you did that. You decided to transition out at some point and go to Yale Business School. Can you talk about why you decided to get out, and then what was the value in business school?
Well, I was a kind of conventional career pathway, so there wasn't a kind of a natural follow-on. I could have stayed in my current unit and did more instruction, and maybe transitioned to the paperwork end for a little while. But it was pretty much more of the same. We really weren't going to be welcomed anywhere else. Once you've kind of broken the mold inside the Air Force. And I was also on my primary driver, though, was that I was on the road 220 days a year, and I had two kids, and I was seeing them in snapshots, like seeing my son a month later, he's bigger and talks more, and then again and again and again. And that wasn't the way I wanted to raise my family. So I figured, okay, well, I could try to exit after 20 years and try to remake my life then, or I can do it now when I'm younger and have more opportunity to get it wrong a couple times and then come out correct. And so I did. I jumped out. All my friends were going to be pilots in the airlines. And one thing I didn't fully anticipate was that after the first Gulf War, all the airlines stopped hiring. They padlocked their doors, and everyone was on furlough. And the furlough was going to last a couple of years. So, okay, I kept on pressing on that for a little while, and that didn't work. And I had to kind of come up with alternative solutions.
So business school, it seems to be, from what I've seen, I did the same thing. Post-military business school is an opportunity to kind of reset, get your eyes on many different domains, many different functions, talk to different people, get different backgrounds, and make a decision. What advice would you have for veterans who are thinking about business school as well?
It was number one on my radar at the time, but I was, a lot of things are happening. A lot of opportunities often come from chance encounters, because you're out there, and as long as you're out there and you're listening, you can hear these chance encounters and actually act on them. In this case, it was a doctor I was seeing for my eye doctor, and then he mentioned he was a Yale grad in medical school, and then he thought I would do great at the Yale Business School. He goes, "It's perfect for people like you. I mean, you fit that mold." And then the more I thought about it, it was like, okay, I have a lot of gaps in my knowledge of business. I was just thinking warfare constantly for the last decade or two, even as a kid. So I had to go back and kind of reset my thinking and kind of get exposed to the economic world. And I applied like 2 weeks before the cutoff of Yale Business School. It was the only one I applied to, and I got right in. And happened to be close to where I was living, at the time, and next to my parents. And then I was able to commute in, and it was fantastic. It was less of an aggressive business school. It was a kind of an international, and it had a pass-fail system. People weren't competing for grades or high honors or anything like that. And it was a great time to just think about where you wanted to go. And there was a good finance section. I was, doing all the finance stuff to maybe go down and trade derivatives on Wall Street. And that was a fantastic experience. And it matured me in a big way. there weren't a lot of military folks, but there were two Army guys that were there with us, and I think both of those guys went into finance. I was thinking finance too, and I at the last moment, I was looking at Citibank job trading derivatives, and the idea of wearing suits all the time and living in the city was just didn't ring for me. And then I saw the cool thing was that at the time in 94, 95, the internet was still new, and the big schools had internet access, unlimited internet access. And you could just dive into it. And I got involved early on with the internet, and I thought it was the coolest thing. And I was like, this is like where everything's going to happen. And I saw this article in Wired magazine, which was Wired was a bi-monthly at the time before it got relatively famous afterwards. And one of the articles in there was an interview with a guy called George Colony, who was the CEO of Forrester Research, which is a kind of strategic technology research company based in Cambridge, Massachusetts. They asked him what he did all day, and he said, well, I sit with my feet up on the windowsill looking out over Harvard Square, thinking about the future of technology. And I thought, man, that's the best. I would love to do that. That sings to me. So yeah, I just took a winger and applied to them. And strangely, the way I wrote, my natural style, this paragraph bullet style, very logically structured, walks people through the argument from small to large, was their internal style of writing. And they had a bear of a time trying to find people who would actually write in that style. They most likely wanted to do essays and things like that, meandering things. And I went through the interview process, which is, the standard, meet everybody, meet the directors, have lunch, that kind of stuff. And the final thing, probably the toughest part of the whole interview, probably the toughest interview I've ever been in, was a 15-on-1 defend your idea, defend your thesis kind of thing. I had to write up a 2-pager in their style, a brief on a topic of my choice. And it was an analysis of Iridium, this Motorola's satellite telephone system. 15 whip smart analysts and the CEO all trying to pick me apart for 2 hours. And I got through it. And, it was a good experience, being able to actually think on your feet and respond in an appropriate way, knowing the topic. And that whole first job is a tough transition. And luckily, I was just brought in, and they said, well, you're smart enough and you can handle this stuff. Figure out what you want to do with the company. And I started working on the Newton and other handhelds, which ended up becoming the iPhone early on, the precursors to that. But I was also bringing in all the internet technology. Forrester had a T1, which was pretty unusual at the time, and which is a good internet connection. And I was bringing in all the new browser stuff, all the, this is cookies, this is how they work, this kind of stuff, and teaching the rest of the company. And everyone was thinking, oh, wow, this is great. He's really on top of this. He knows a lot more about this than the rest of us. Why doesn't he run the internet service? So they launched an internet service, and they had me kick that off, and wrote my first reports with George Colony, the CEO, and he goes, "You write fantastic. You can handle this." And I started writing, and the service just zoomed. And they were like a less than $20 million company a year in revenue, pretty much sideways for probably 6 or 7 years, producing the same revenue. And this new service within a year added 5 million. So it was like, which browser, the portals, and ranking the portals before they went public, that kind of stuff. I don't know of any other person at the time that was a professional, get paid internet analyst. I was probably the only guy doing this. Every single reporter who was covering this topic, because it went from the trade press that was covering technology to the mainstream press starting covering technology. So the Business Weeks and the Wall Street Journals and the New York Times all wanted to get into technology now. Kind of had a knack for kind of distilling it down to like a little soundbite, and educated these reporters. And I was in the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, Business Week, on and on and on. Virtually every week I had 1 or 2 or 3 hits. CNBC, BBC. It was a hell of an experience just being right at the eye of the storm, where every single internet company, every startup between 95 and 97 had to come through my doors.
Wild.
I was ranking the portals and saying, Yahoo wins, and having all the other portals like Lycos and stuff calling me up and bitching me out and stuff like that. So, well, it was just cool. It was fun.
You witnessed the birth of the internet prior to scale. And I think from your work now that I'm reading about, it gives you a really unique insight from the get-go. I want to bounce around a little bit. You did a lot of entrepreneurial work, but I want to try to get to your current ideas. And one bridge between Forrester and now is Brave New War. Slate called you the futurist. Can you basically summarize your thesis for that book, and how does it still apply today?
So I started writing a blog called Global Guerrillas because I was involved in doing the early social networking stuff, RSS, and the kind of first social network we kind of built. And to support that idea, I started blogging, and I started blogging on warfare, mainly because what I saw coming out of the Iraq War in 2003 in terms of analysis, what didn't ring true to me. Didn't seem like it was actually explaining the situation in a way that would make it solvable. And things were spinning out of control. So I started applying kind of my technical background, and I saw parallels between what I was studying in software, and in particular open source software, and the dynamics of networks and the internet to what I was seeing in Iraq. And developed a bunch of ideas and a big following on the blog. And I got a New York Times op-ed out of it and other things as people were looking for new insights. And then I distilled that down. I was able to take all the blog posts and then create a cohesive narrative for a book, A Brave New War. And that came out, and it was picked up by David Brooks at the New York Times, and he wrote a review on it. And it just zoomed, and they ran out of books on Amazon. It was like up to number 2 on Amazon. And then before they ran out of books on it, and it went through like 3-4 printings since then. But it was a good experience. It was fun. I've been told later that the chairman of the Joint Chiefs read it and loved it, and his advisor was gushing over it. So it's like, so it got legs. And then I did a bunch of interactions with people all across all the different agencies, from the NSA to the CIA a lot, all the DoD branches, doing speeches, doing consulting, doing that kind of stuff, getting people up to speed.
That model is interesting. So you started out as the blog, that got traction, that became the book. What do you think about that model for people who are out there who also want to do some big thinking, start connecting the dots? Do you think that's an effective model?
Oh, it's 100% the best way. You know that Julia project, that one where they did Julia Childs?
I don't know.
Where she wrote, there was a movie made with Meryl Streep in it, Julia to Julia or whatever, where this woman named Julia wrote about doing every single recipe in Julia Child's famous French cooking book. And I got her started on a blog, got her set up, and she was writing this, and it was day after day she did a new recipe and wrote it up, and she got a huge following, which then she folded all together and then created a book, which then became the movie. Trying to come up with a book based on a bunch of notes or just, from a cold start is incredibly hard. You might have a core idea, but all the stuff that supports all the logic is hard to come up with. Best way is to do it in pieces on a blog. And you do it in public because that forces you to get beyond writer's block. Writer block is this thing where you have a higher standard for your work than other people do. Right? And what you'll find is that if you write it, if people respond nicely to it, it's often, being held to a far lower standard than what you would do to yourself, being a perfectionist or whatever. And then it allows you to develop ideas over time. You build a following, and this is critical, is that you build a following and you build like a mailing list of people who are interested in the book. And the bigger your mailing list, the less you need professional publishers, because all they really do is provide you marketing. They don't do anything else. Used to be getting you in bookstores, but that's not even the case. If you have your own mailing list and you have 20 or 30,000 people that follow you, you don't need them at all. And you can sell it in electronic form on Amazon, or you can also sell it get a print run, and you'd have somebody front you the money for that, but you really don't need a professional to help you with that. And I found that having all of that written content over the course of like 2, 3, 4 years, and you could cherry pick it, and then I rearranged it, and it all had withstood the crucible of pushback from people in public. And it was out there, and some pieces didn't make it because they fell apart under the criticism of people who knew about some aspect of something that I didn't know. And then I was able to, say, okay, that's good. That's trash. Then you pointed it out. That's great. By doing it in public, you were allowed to kind of unearth that. Yeah, no, it's a fantastic way. So you build up the marketing muscle to be successful at it. And then you also get your ideas out and tested, and then you can just stitch them together. Stitching them all together into a cohesive book, at least for my standards, was really tough. I have to have the whole idea, the whole book in my head, from the simplest thing all the way up through, and they all have to flow. And I did it sitting in Florida while my kids were over at Disneyland. I must have smoked like 3 packs a day, sitting there at the pool doing this, but was only able to handle it for that week. And now it's kind of back into normal space. But yeah, that was a tough process.
Before we get into a couple of your current reports, or the reports you're putting out on Global Guerrilla right now, are they also a future book, or are you going to stick with the blog format?
I could generate a couple books off of all the writing I did on the Global Guerrillas Report. I mean, it's more formalized, and the writing is a lot better than what I did on Global Guerrillas on the blog. The blog was like, fast from the hip, but things are changing so fast. It's actually even better to have it as a report. I did it on Substack and Patreon, so it's actually making money while I was doing that. It's probably making more money doing that than I would be if I was doing a book. What the book allows me to do is get more on the speaking circuit. But I really ever enjoyed speaking on the speaking circuit. It really wasn't something I sought after. Yeah, no, I could do it. I'm just probably too lazy at this point, and things are moving too fast, and new things are cropping up, and I'm going, man, if I had written that book then, it would have not included this stuff, and which changed the environment even more.
You got something great with Global Gorilla. So let's talk about the packetized media report you had. It was March of this year, but it is still extremely current. And I'm very curious to hear your thoughts about it. So you talk about how books and movies became posts on TikTok and X. You talk about how paintings became Instagram, letters became emojis. And then you talked about how we stitch all these packets together and how it impacts our cognition, our worldview. Can you delve into that and break that down?
The idea is that the electronic media, the kind of internet media, social networking media that we're exposed to now, has all been broken down into small packets, like a single idea, a single concept, whether it's images or videos or blocks of text. They're being produced in an incredible volume from millions of different people and millions of different sources. And it becomes a torrential flow. And that's changed us. It changed the way we think. It's rewired us. We were mentally rewired after the printing press. I mean, there's actual physical changes to our brain before reading and after reading. Where you grew up reading the Bible as a Protestant and after the early Reformation, those physical changes manifested in different ways of patterns of thinking. And all the changes that we saw after the printing press, for example, would be like constitutional government replacing monarchy. On a piece of printed paper, pamphlets, for ideas and media flow, organized science, where you print manuscripts with your idea, and then that's peer reviewed, and there's a bureaucracy, and all of the bureaucracy and its paper pushing and everything else that developed out of that. Finance, modern finance, with ledgers and printed charters for companies and things like this. It changed the way we thought, and we thought in reading long form documents and then arguing those ideas based on that process of thinking to reorganizing society. And we're seeing this something similar now with packetized media, where everything's broken down to these core ideas. We don't think in terms of reading a long form or hearing or experiencing, a long form media block, like watching a movie or a full telecast or reading a full book or even a full article in a magazine, is that we're pattern matchers. In order to handle the kind of massive flow that we're experiencing, is that we have to pick items out of the flow that catch our interest, usually novel items that match something that we're constantly focusing on, and then we stitch them together into patterns that allow us to make sense of the world around us. That's a completely different way of thinking than what we grew up doing, and it's changing the way we're organizing society. We already see it in the rise of different kind of organizational methods. One would be like the network tribalism that we see in the political level, where patterns are curated to fight opposing political parties, and that people constantly curating the news in order to kind of spin it in a way that would damage the opposition, where you have millions of co-curators working on that pattern, constantly looking at every piece of news that's coming through and then spinning it so it fits that tribe's pattern. But it's also giving all the institutions and organizations that we relied upon in the old world, the kind of long form media world, a lot of fits, a lot of problems. Their authority is kind of weakening, their legitimacy is weakening, their ability to control the messaging is non-existent now. And that's kind of hollowing these organizations out, hollowing out the state, hollowing out lots of things that we relied upon in the past. Yeah, there's lots of ideas here. It's better to read it as pieces as a report so you can get piece at a time.
You brought up the Bible, which is a good example. So printing press, Bible, there was a central authority that could, for the most part, control what you're able to read.
Right.
But now you have millions of different influencers who could determine or influence what you read and what you spend your time thinking about. That is wild. And you said like the way we grew up, but a lot of people are growing up with that now. They don't grow up with one book in the household. They grow up with a laptop and access to anything that could possibly reach them. So if you could make a prophecy, where do you think that's going to end up 10 or 20 years from now?
Ooh, this kind of social networking, rewiring of our brains and rewiring of society is changing us a lot faster than we fully appreciate, and it's going to get even faster. One of the things that I wrote about just on Twitter or on X was that we saw fertility rates drop around the world, every country except for one or two smaller ones, but it was a simultaneous drop, and it wasn't a slow drop based on historical patterns of declines. It was like precipitous. It just fell. The whole floor of fertility globally just fell. The impact of that, or the reason for that, if you look at all the different potential factors that happen in every single country at the same time, tracks very nicely with the rise of social networking on smartphones. It went from 0 in 2007 to 5 billion users in 2023. So it changed the way we think in family formation, whether we have kids or not kids. I mean, it changed the fundamental nature of human beings. And things are going to get wild as we start to add different elements to this. The new elements, which would be AI and augmented reality and robotics, that's going to be absolutely insane. I mean, where whole classes of work are wiped out, like autonomous driving is going to wipe out the biggest job category, driving, very, very quickly. And then robotics is going to wipe out a lot of the kind of physical labor that we do. And tutoring, getting a constant tutor from an AI that will produce substantially better results than you would get from any kind of mass education. And you can have that AI tutor tons of people. Prediction is going to get nuts. The old structures, the old institutions, the old states aren't doing well. You can see it fracturing across the West. They don't have a solution. The countries that are gearing up to kind of survive this, they're doing it in the wrong way, but they're doing it. It'd be China. They focused on a very narrow cultural interpretation, and they're enforcing it. And they're enforcing computer time limits and gaming limits and all this other stuff. And they're doubling down on trying to say, okay, this is our cultural view of what a family and a society should look like. And they're locking it down because they don't want to be ripped apart by the changes underway. And they're being very repressive about it, which is the downside. Yeah, the big problem for us would be that everything falls apart because everyone's just like going off into the tall grass, screaming with their hair on fire.
That would be a cosmic irony if the only nations that survived were the authoritarian nations, and the liberal democracies imploded just from being torn apart in all these different directions. That would be wild. I think we're going to get to that. I do want to talk about your 2024 election one, but before we get there, the next step would be the Israel pager attack. You had some really interesting thoughts there. And you talked about how the technology that we surround ourselves with can then be turned against us and weaponized against us. And it's even more interesting when your prior example about the Bible versus a million different influencers, it can happen selectively and targeted. And then number two, it undermined trust in the global supply system, which makes sense because if we look at our smartphone every day and there's a possibility that it could blow up, that changes things quite drastically. Can you talk about your main thesis in that piece and kind of how it impacts us going forward?
Right. The systems disruption it was something I wrote about in Brave New War, and I've written about since. It's a way for small groups or individuals to to fight above their weight class. They could, if you disrupted a network, you can amplify the effects of your attack. And I've seen returns on investment, for every dollar invested in the attack, up to 1,000,000 to 1. So you do $1 million in damage for $1 invested in an attack. The reason it works that way is that networks are interconnected, and often elements are tightly coupled, and one network is relying on another network. And if you do damage one critical node, it can just cascade over, knocking one network down, and which knocks the next network down, and the next, and then it has business ramifications and lost opportunity, lost production. Things just break down, and there's costs associated with that. The thing with the pager attack was that usually states don't do that, because they tend to be more vulnerable to those kind of disruptive attacks. And to have a state do it is unsettling for a lot of people, because it shows that the global supply chain that we have isn't that trustworthy. That could be sabotage built into the systems that we're using on an ongoing basis that could explode in our face in a similar way, because no one's checking for it. This stuff is not obvious to casual examination in many instances, and it could be inserted into the product at various stages. If it was built into it, you wouldn't even know what to look for in terms of having the battery ignite, or if there was just an extra coating on a battery that could explode. So this global system that we have is a lot more dangerous than a lot of people currently attribute to it.
There's this general sense of unease and ripping apart of the fabric of each person's mind. And that kind of leads us to the 2024 election, is the way I see that heading. And you, in the tribal election report you wrote, you said that the election is not about the candidates, but about the tribes. The networked tribes is what you called them. And you said people aren't selecting their candidate, they're selecting their tribe. And they're not voting for their tribe, but they're voting against the other tribe. And I've heard that again and again and again in the last few elections. So it's not about the policies. It's not about the principles. It's about the threat posed by the other tribe. That is some primal, ancient human stuff in combination with the technology we're talking about, how it is rewiring our brains, and how it is also inherently not to be trusted anymore. There's a lot to unpack there. So let's start with just network tribes. Can you define that and make it contextual now, because it's happening. Election's happening in a week or two.
So the idea of network tribes came out of my work back in open source insurgency in Iraq, where there were 70 different groups that somehow worked together, not one cohesive insurgency, or not just two, but 70 relatively small groups that somehow coordinated. And that mechanism of coordination, I called it open source insurgency, where they wipe out one small group, another one pops up. It's very innovative, no barriers to entry into participation in the conflict. And that morphed into open source protest in Egypt and Tunisia, where those big protests. We saw it in Nomas Farc. Lots of different people came together with different motivations for joining, but for that moment to take on an enemy, a single enemy, achieve something very specific. I call it, in open source software, it's called the plausible promise, that one idea that unites people that couldn't even sit in the same room together to join together to go take something on. And then it morphed into open source politics with the Trump campaign. That insurgent campaign that he ran was all open source. It was people at all these different forums, all doing the work. The actual campaign itself was pretty poorly run, but all that other contribution actually put him over the finish line. And the idea was to put somebody who would be disruptive into the White House, disruptive to the policies and system that all these participants were against. The problem with open source organizational types is that they disband once they achieve something. Or if they get frustrated long enough, they kind of just fall apart and the groups start fighting amongst each other or whatever. That changed in the opposition to Trump, and now we see it now in our current election, is that they've added an element of cohesion, and that cohesion is tribalism, because tribalism is like the cockroach of history, organizational history for human beings. It's been around since we were human, and it's the most natural organizational type, even more fundamental than clans. What tribes did is that they created a cohesion that was similar to blood relations. And they did that, called the fictive kinship. And they did that by creating stories and rituals and other mechanisms to unite people in a kind of a common narrative of, why we came together, how we overcame adversity, where we're going together. That whole story and ritual created a kinship that allows people to fight together and handle problems together, even though they're not blood relations necessarily. Tribalism morphed as we added different organizational decision-making systems like bureaucracy and markets and things like that. And we get to the present day, and its network form. Network tribalism uses an open source dynamic in terms of recruiting and in terms of how it generates new ideas. But the tribalism is kind of broken. And instead of what we are good together doing, a positive kind of forward-looking, uniting mission that requires a lot of agreement, it uses kind of the open source mentalities that all we have to do is agree on one thing: hatred of the enemy. And if we all hate the enemy, we all share a fictive kinship. You can generate that through videos, like I call them empathy triggers, like a George Floyd video. The George Floyd video was perfect. We don't have a lot of the barriers to empathy transfer online that we do in the offline world. We see somebody rubbing your windshield, you could space that out, right? Or you could see somebody on the side of the road. You don't have to immediately stop and then turn your life upside down to go help them at that moment. Your choice, you have control. But online, what happens is when people saw that, like the George Floyd video, they felt the knee on their neck. Empathy isn't what we think it is. It's not sympathy. It's an involuntary modeling of another person's mind. And it's like a forcible transfer if you're not guarded against it. And so when they saw George Floyd, they were George Floyd. There was a fictive kinship bond formed, and they felt that knee on their neck, and they felt that hatred of the cop doing that. And they could see it in rats and other things. A rat gets electrocuted in front of another rat. That rat viewing it clenches up their muscles in their teeth. That modeling is a big amount of information being transferred instantaneously. It's great if you're telling a story about, like, I went and hunted and did this, and people could revel in your heroism or cower in fear at the potential danger of what you just saw. A lot of information in a short period of time that can change behavior. So we created these tribes that are based on enemies. And then you add the pattern matching to it. And the pattern matching is this big, sprawling network tribe of a bunch of independent contributors, each hating the enemy for their own reasons, their own motivations for actually joining. And they're all curating the information flow that goes to everybody else in the larger environment. And every piece of information, packetized information, is then spun to fit the narrative of the enemy, the narrative, the pattern of the enemy, a pattern of behavior that they're opposing. And these things are really effective, and they have staying power. They have, that cohesion that tribalism adds allows them to stick around for a while. And they've come to dominate politics. Now you can see it in the political battle right now, is that these candidates aren't for anything. I haven't heard any real policy discussion out of either camp. And anytime, and it works in open source terms, if you actually came up with policies, you would actually divide your support because you're trying to achieve things that aren't part of that one singular collective goal. As soon as anyone, like in Egyptian protests, started talking about reforming the Constitution, they were marginalized. That leader, when it got pushed to the side, it was all about getting Mubarak to step down. We have these two tribes just calling each other names, each trying to up the ante, up the level of rhetoric, demonizing the opposition. My words, where does that go next? What is network tribalism in the election? It has the potential to look something very similar, kind of like a network fascism, left and right. Doesn't really matter. If they're both formed at basic opposition, it could end up like that. And there's a trap with that. Well, we saw in 20th century fascism, and it's a loaded word, people don't understand how it works. But if you look at fascism as a 20th century system of governance, and democracy, democratic capitalism as a system of governance, and communism as a system of governance, fascism as a system solved the problem of how do you get a capitalist economy to operate as if it was in total war constant, as a command economy, though it's a capitalist economy. And you derive the benefits of a capitalist economy because you have all these different corporations actually running the different parts and competing and keeping it efficient, coming up with innovations. Whereas like a communist system, as everything is in the same bureaucracy, becomes inefficient, unwieldy, the more complex you get. The fascist system did that by creating a focus on an enemy, a common enemy. And they used massive propaganda and what they called in Germany, Gleichschaltung, meaning that everyone had to face the same enemy. The flaw in that, it creates all sorts of cohesion. And we're seeing that now with the network tribalism. It creates an incredible amount of cohesion focusing on the enemy like that. The flaw in that approach is that you have to keep on upping the ante. You have to keep on cranking the rheostat on it to make it the enemy even more vicious and more existential and more imminent in terms of their danger. And it's directed against internal and external enemies, right? And if you end up like Germany, you end up killing, 17 million people domestically, and you end up at war with every country in the world almost, right? Because it runs out of control. It can't be stopped. It's your source of cohesion, yet any argument against it is you become an enemy of the state. The internal flaw is it blows up. It's inevitable. It's an unlimited escalation. I wrote like 2021. I was like, okay, I'm worried that the kind of network tribalism we're seeing at the political realm could actually have effects on war and peace globally. And I wrote a thing saying I think Israel is going to be the first target. I already see a shift when they were doing, killing off the peaceful protesters when they were trying the non-violence approach, and Israel was shooting the protesters. There was a negative kind of resonance within the network that I thought had potential to become kind of make Israel a tribal target. And I wrote up a brief on that, and I was wrong. They eventually became a tribal target, as we saw just recently, but it was Russia that got hit first. Is that the tribalism in the Biden administration, the anti-Trumpism became, we're not going to modify Trump's policies. We're going to take the absolute opposite in regards to the border, in regards to Russia. And then we're going to try to punish Russia because they're our enemy by extending, and people will disagree with this, but the reality is it's a push to extend the NATO membership to Ukraine to punish Russia. And Russia reacted badly. And then Russia, being Putin, being connected to Trump, being connected to the ultimate evil, created this swarm-like response, the tribal response on a global level that led to a hardening of the rhetoric and then the kind of framing of the conflict into an existential conflict, repeat of Hitler invading Europe. They're going to take all of Europe. That now we have to restart the Cold War with Russia. We disconnected them across thousands of companies and thousands of connections, and people were Russians were being kicked out of discussion forums. It's just nuts. We went from 0 to 100 and ratcheted our way up on the Kant's nuclear ladder to just one step below nuclear exchange within a couple of weeks. And the rhetoric from Biden became, this is the democracy against authoritarianism. We're gonna halt them on the beaches, kind of thing. That kind of tribalism now got us up to the edge of nuclear war. It's a problem, and the same kind of tribalism dynamic that impacted the current Israel conflict is tough too. It's in the sense that it's led to a level of aggression on Israel's side that is not mitigated by common sense and strategy, and vice versa. The aggression, the hatred of Israel now is growing because of the same tribalism on the other side. It's unleashed a dynamic there that's going to be disastrous. Already has been disastrous. So yeah, tribalism is tough. It's a network tribalism is a whole different beast. It has that open source dynamic, which makes it operate in weird ways that most people don't understand. And it's it's negative. And taming that beast, I think we're going to figure out a way to tame it. We figured out the way to tame printing. Printing created all sorts of stuff. It created the 30 Years' War. Germany was flooded with pamphlets that attacked everything. Attacked the religious structures, attacked the political structures, attacked feudalism. It created revolutionary movements and wild forms of government within the Holy Roman Empire and within those little constituent states. It was wild and chaotic, and it took years and years and years to kind of work out the kinks. So we're gonna do the same thing with this, but it's gonna take a time.
Yeah, if we could, let's pull ourselves within the borders of America for the next step. You make me think about the philosopher Eric Hoffer came up with the idea of mass movements. An example would be like the rise of the Nazis in Germany or the Bolsheviks and then the communists in the Soviet Union. And his belief was that you couldn't ever have a successful mass movement in America because life is generally too good. You're making me wonder what happens when there's the perception that life is not good, even though reality is otherwise. Do you think that given the perception, this tribalism over the internet and these digital tribes, do you think that might actually open the door to some sort of mass movement in America, even though life actually isn't that bad?
Or you mean, can tribalism get to a point where we justify killing tens of thousands of people, interning them? Just what happened to Israel. We just did it. People have said no problem with that. I mean, they have no problem, seeing 40,000 people snuffed out. They justified it like that. So to that extent, I mean, I'm not going to try to argue one way or another on whether it was justified or not, or whether they were efficient. I thought it was kind of sloppy personally, but the idea that we can find a way to justify mass killing internally and go to war with everyone externally is certainly there. And we'll find a way in our heads, in our network logic, and the way we spin the information to justify killing that many people. Whether it's MAGA heads, they're being killed, or whether it's people who are Antifas on the other side, or immigrants, or illegal immigrants that it came across. So it's like, it can be justified in this environment. My confidence that it wouldn't be is pretty much shot at this point. I didn't think we would get into a new Cold War. I thought, how stupid can we be? But I underestimated the level of confusion and mental degradation collectively that got us to that point. We're in a new Cold War. And eventually it's lining up to be a new Cold War with Russia, China, most of the rest of Asia, most of the Middle East, lots of countries in Africa and Venezuela, Cuba, a bunch of other countries. And they'll get drones and everything else. It's going to be one contested space around the world. And we're not prepared to beat that. We don't have the internal cohesion, necessary to pull that off. I mean, we're going into this without even the positive, internal narrative. We spent the last 20 years ripping down the American narrative that we're better together, that we're fundamentally good, and we try to do the right thing. That's all been crashed, ripping down statues and wiping out narratives. What that means is we don't have the cohesion that we needed, to actually engage in a high conflict world. That's kind of depressing, but yeah, we went from just normal stuff like, life experience all the way up to the nutty stuff that's going on now.
It keeps it interesting. That's opportunity as well. So let's pivot to a more positive note. So we talked about a possible way to solve that and prevent this catastrophe. You could look at the authoritarian route that China is doing to maintain their culture, which is certainly not like the right way to do it, but a way to do it. You came up with a concept of resilient communities, and I think that's probably a way to do it in a free system without that top-down authoritarian impulse. And it seems like that resilient community would take care of the packetized problem, manage to control some of the negative aspects of technology and what it can do to us, and even kind of dismantle some of these network tribes. So just to end on a positive note, like a few minute summary of your concept of resilient communities and how that brings it back under our control.
General concept is that you decentralize control. You do that through, having digital rights and making the digital world concrete. So you have speech rights that are protected and can be resolved through process, that common process, whether you're on a company site or you're on a government site. The other piece would be data ownership. Is the data is the oil that fuels all the AIs, right? So if you have data ownership, you have a piece in this new economy, and then you have some control over where that data goes. But you can also get royalties and other things. But data ownership is like a key element. It's like owning your own land. It's like having your own plot. And I'm not talking just data in terms of your address. I'm talking about everything you do, your facial expressions, your movement, everything you say, your voice, your house, everything in it. It's all data that can be used to feed AIs. And AIs have an unlimited appetite for that. And they're the most valuable technological artifacts around. And then pushing a lot of the production and control to the individual and community level through resilient communities, meaning that the communities actually have a degree of production capacity across a variety of different things for energy and water and food, that if things do disconnect and we become more turbulent, where there's intermittent disconnection, that the community can weather it and handle it. But that independence, ability to produce, also provides you a certain degree of independence. And some of the tools that you would need would be open source. It's like open source AIs, critical piece here. And if AIs are going to be so good in tutoring your kids, you want some control over them. You want a local instantiation of that AI. And you can run AIs on a beefy PC now. Having a control of the AI, you can actually control, the value set that your kids are going to get out of that tutor, rather than relying on some central organization, some corporation, or some government to kind of dictate that. And what we've seen in schools recently is probably a good thing that you take control. And a lot more of kind of local production. One thing I found when I did a lot of lawnscaping, turning a lawn into a little mini farm, not too close to the house, obviously, because you don't want the rodents and other things in there. It's a lot of work. A lot of the AI and robotics and other things are going to help that. A lot of really cool things that will plant for you and harvest for you and care for things. And that gives you a lot of leverage at the local level. Batteries at scale, inexpensive, give you a lot of leverage over control of power. Getting more control at the local allows us to weather a lot of the kind of disruptions that are going to occur at the global and the national. Makes it possible for us to say no if they go too far. But without that, you don't want to get into this kind of centralized authoritarian system, because the corporations have already built a system that could be the most repressive authoritarian system ever devised. I mean, by several orders of magnitude, would make anyone in the DDR and in the Cold War, East Germany, salivate, because it doesn't require the bureaucracy necessary to implement it. It could be done all from AI, a scalable AI that can watch every single conversation simultaneously in real time and redirect you and chastise you and note for future kind of limitations on what you can do and what you should be able to accomplish.
I'll wrap it up with one last question. A couple books that have changed your life you'd recommend?
I like all the original writers better. When I read about a scientific discovery, I try to go back to the original scientific discovery and figure it out. One thing that was really pivotal for me is reading the collected works of Nietzsche, every single book he wrote.
Oh, nice. Yeah.
Yep. And it's a lot of writing. It's a lot different than you get portrayed. Most people have the will to power, but that was kind of a collected thing by his sister. All the other books are a lot more interesting. But the idea of actually philosophizing with a hammer, I love that. And then I read the Schopenhauer and the Dostoevsky, and all the old Plutarch's Lives was great. Xenophon's Anabasis was awesome. Of course, you read the Iliad. More recently, in the last 20 or 30, though, I've been reading more science fiction, at least the old ones. And that helped me a lot in terms of thinking. Guys like Bruce Sterling was amazing. Wrote in the 80s and 90s in particular. And his book, like Islands in the Net, amazing. Gibson was good. Stevenson was good. It was early Stevenson. If you want to think about how, in terms of technology changing so quickly, you got to read that stuff or you'll fall behind. One of the things I would always want to do is I always want to write a science fiction book, probably next. And I have the idea, the environment, and some of the plot down. Just haven't committed it to paper yet. And I have some ideas in terms of how AI, augmented reality, and networks all interconnect to create kind of this opportunity space, which I think would be positive for us, which would be cool and different than the way people are approaching things. And if I can crystallize it in a way that's compelling, I think can get people to move in that direction.
I look forward to it. A lot of your writing is showing that the differential between sci-fi and reality is shrinking a bit, but I imagine with creativity, it could be good. This was awesome. How can people follow you in your work?
At John Robb, JOHNROBB on X. And then I have a Substack, Global Guerrillas Report, and a Patreon, Global Guerrillas Report. The Patreon also has like a Discord site attached to it. It's more the older crowd. The people have been following me for a decade or more. I write a report every 2 weeks, hopefully. Try to get those out, an occasional podcast. Then I promote it. It's easier than running my own podcast.
Anything else you want to add before we wrap it up?
Be a pattern matcher. Don't try to take it all in at once, just to pull the useful items out of it. If anything I do with my work is I try to help people frame a complex, rapidly changing world in a way that, makes sense for them to be able to make good decisions. So my primary clients at Forrester and other places were CEOs that were frozen because everything was changing so quick. They didn't have any way of comprehending or planning out into the future. And I gave them some frameworks that they didn't agree with 100% of it, but it gave them a starting point so they can actually see a trajectory forward and then make decisions. And I'm trying to do that with people every day with my writing. Just give them a framework, give them a point of reference that they can piece things together, a pattern, or understanding how something works. That's useful and actionable. So if that appeals to you, this is good.
John, really, really do appreciate it. Thank you for coming on board.
Thanks.
All right, cool. That's it for this episode. If you want to check out more from the podcast, head to zeroeyes.com/Nobel, where you can see show notes, read more about our guests, and suggest guests or topics of your own. Until next time, stay in the fight. Don't ring the bell.